There are moments in war when defeat does not arrive with a single explosion, a single battle, or a single announcement. Sometimes defeat arrives quietly, through reports that stop making sense, losses that cannot be replaced, and pilots who begin to realize that the sky no longer belongs to them. For Germany, the loss of the air war did not happen in one day. It happened slowly, painfully, and long before the war itself ended. And by the time this realization became unavoidable, it was already too late to change the outcome. At the beginning of the Second World War, German air power was feared across Europe. The Luftwaffe had crushed Poland in weeks, overwhelmed France in days, and supported lightning-fast advances that shocked the world. German commanders believed they had built the most effective air force on Earth, designed not for defense, but for domination. For a time, the evidence seemed to support that belief. But war has a way of exposing weaknesses that confidence hides. And nowhere was that more true than in the air war over Europe. What makes this story important is not just how Germany lost control of the skies, but when it began to understand that it was losing. The realization did not come from propaganda broadcasts or enemy speeches. It came from German pilots returning to base with empty fuel tanks and bullet-ridden aircraft. It came from commanders reading production reports that no longer matched battlefield losses. And it came from an enemy whose strength was not measured only in planes, but in factories, training pipelines, and an industrial system that Germany could not match. To understand the moment Germany realized the air war was lost, we need to go back to the assumptions that shaped its strategy. The Luftwaffe was never designed for a long war of attrition. It was built to support rapid ground offensives, not to fight an extended battle for air superiority against an industrial superpower. Early successes reinforced this flawed design. Each victory made German planners more confident that speed and skill would always compensate for numbers. When the war expanded beyond Europe and drew in the United States, those assumptions were tested in ways Germany had never prepared for. American aircraft did not arrive in small numbers. They arrived in waves, and behind every plane shot down stood a system capable of replacing it faster than Germany could destroy it. This imbalance would become the central reality of the air war, even as German leaders struggled to accept it. At first, German commanders believed the problem was tactical. They adjusted formations, modified intercept strategies, and pushed pilots harder. Losses were explained away as temporary setbacks. The idea that the Luftwaffe could be fundamentally outmatched was unthinkable, yet the data told a different story. Each month, more German pilots failed to return. Each month, training hours were reduced. And each month, Allied bomber streams grew larger, not smaller. The air war was no longer about skill alone, it was about endurance. And endurance favored the side that could afford to lose aircraft, crews, and fuel without collapsing. Germany could not. Its economy, already strained by years of conflict, was being forced into a race it had no chance of winning. This is the story of how that realization took shape inside the German command structure. Not as a single moment of surrender, but as a gradual acknowledgement that control of the air was slipping away, and that without it everything else would follow. The ground war, the cities, the factories, and ultimately the fate of the Reich itself were now tied to a sky Germany could no longer defend. In the years leading up to the war, Germany's confidence in its air power was not accidental. It was built on experience, innovation, and a series of early victories that reshaped modern warfare. The Luftwaffe was not simply another air force. It was a tool designed to work in perfect coordination with fast-moving ground armies. Bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft operated as part of a single system, striking ahead of advancing troops and breaking enemy resistance before it could fully form. This approach had worked with devastating effectiveness in Spain, Poland, and France, reinforcing the belief that air superiority could be achieved quickly and decisively. German planners did not envision the air war as a prolonged struggle. Their doctrine assumed that conflicts would be short, enemies would collapse under rapid pressure, and industrial endurance would never become the deciding factor. Aircraft were optimized for performance and tactical effectiveness, not ease of mass production or long-term sustainability. Pilots were trained extensively, sometimes for years, producing a relatively small but highly skilled cadre. This emphasis on quality over quantity made sense in a war that Germany believed would be won before attrition mattered. The problem was that this vision of war depended on controlling the pace and scale of conflict. When Germany fought smaller or less industrialized opponents, the Luftwaffe's advantages were overwhelming. Enemy air forces were destroyed on the ground, communication networks collapsed, and resistance crumbled. These victories created a dangerous illusion that German air power was not only superior, but inherently unbeatable. Few within the command structure questioned whether these successes would translate to a global war against nations capable of producing aircraft, fuel and trained crews on an unprecedented scale. The Battle of Britain offered an early warning that the Luftwaffe's assumptions were flawed. German pilots encountered an enemy that could replace losses, adapt tactics, and fight defensively over familiar territory. Although Germany inflicted damage, it failed to achieve air superiority, and the invasion of Britain was abandoned. Yet even this setback was rationalized rather than internalized. Many German leaders attributed the failure to tactical errors or missed opportunities, not to structural weaknesses in their air strategy. As the war expanded eastward with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe again achieved early dominance. Vast numbers of Soviet aircraft were destroyed in the opening weeks, and German pilots recorded extraordinary kill ratios. Once more, success reinforced belief. But beneath these impressive numbers lay the same underlying vulnerability. Germany was consuming experienced pilots and aircraft at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. Losses that seemed acceptable in the short term were quietly eroding the foundation of German air power. When the United States entered the war, the strategic environment changed completely. Unlike Germany's previous opponents, the United States brought with it an industrial system designed for prolonged conflict. American planners did not measure success by individual engagements alone. They planned for attrition, replacement, and scale. Aircraft were designed not only to perform, but to be produced, repaired, and replaced efficiently. Training programs emphasized volume as well as competence, ensuring a steady flow of crews regardless of losses. Initially, German commanders underestimated this shift. American air power was viewed as inexperienced and untested. Reports from early encounters were often dismissive, focusing on perceived weaknesses in American formations or tactics. But these assessments failed to account for what mattered most. Every encounter, regardless of outcome, moved the balance further away from Germany's favor. Even when German pilots succeeded tactically, the strategic picture continued to worsen. The skies over Europe gradually became more crowded, not with German aircraft, but with Allied bombers and fighters. Escort ranges increased, formations grew larger. Missions that once seemed exceptional became routine. For German pilots, the air war began to feel less like a contest of skill and more like a relentless test of endurance. Each sortie carried greater risk, not because the enemy was individually superior, but because the enemy could afford to keep coming. Inside the Luftwaffe, the first signs of recognition began to surface. Training hours were reduced as fuel became scarce. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with fewer flight hours and less combat preparation. Maintenance crews struggled to keep aging aircraft operational under constant pressure. Commanders faced impossible choices, deciding which sectors to defend and which to abandon. These were not signs of defeat yet, but they were unmistakable indicators that the balance of power in the air was shifting. This period marked the beginning of a slow and painful realization. Germany was no longer dictating the terms of the air war. It was reacting. And in a war defined by industrial capacity and sustained pressure, reaction was not enough. The Luftwaffe had been built for speed and precision, not for a marathon against an opponent whose strength lay in its ability to endure. From this point forward, the German response to the air war became increasingly reactive rather than strategic. Decisions were no longer driven by long-term planning, but by immediate necessity. Each new Allied offensive forced German commanders to shift resources from one crisis to another, often solving yesterday's problem at the cost of tomorrow's collapse. Fighter units were redeployed constantly, airfields were overworked, and supply lines were stretched thin as the Luftwaffe attempted to defend too much with too little. One of the most damaging consequences of this shift was the erosion of pilot quality. Early in the war, German pilots benefited from extensive training and combat experience gained in earlier campaigns. By the middle years of the conflict, that advantage had disappeared. Training programs were shortened repeatedly to meet frontline demand, reducing both flight hours and tactical preparation. New pilots were sent into combat with minimal experience, often facing veteran Allied aircrews supported by superior numbers and increasingly effective coordination. Fuel shortages made the problem even worse. As Allied bombing campaigns targeted refineries and transportation networks, aviation fuel became scarce. Even experienced pilots found themselves grounded, unable to train or maintain proficiency. Aircraft that could have been operational sat idle, not because of mechanical failure, but because there was simply not enough fuel to fly them. This invisible limitation quietly undermined every attempt to rebuild German air strength. At the same time, maintenance systems began to break down under constant pressure. Aircraft designed for high performance were difficult to repair in field conditions, especially as spare parts became harder to obtain. Mechanics worked around the clock to keep aging airframes operational, often improvising solutions that could not withstand sustained combat use. The gap between aircraft on paper and aircraft actually available for missions grew wider with each passing month. German leadership responded by placing increasing faith in technological solutions. New aircraft designs and advanced weapons were rushed into development with the hope that innovation could reverse the balance of power. Jet fighters, rocket interceptors, and experimental bombers promised dramatic performance improvements. On paper, these projects looked impressive. In reality, they arrived too late in numbers too small, and with reliability issues that limited their impact. Technology could not compensate for a collapsing training system and a shrinking industrial base. The emphasis on advanced designs also diverted resources away from proven platforms that could have been produced more efficiently. Factories struggled to balance innovation with output, often achieving neither. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft production continued to accelerate, benefiting from standardized designs, simplified maintenance requirements, and an uninterrupted flow of raw materials. The contrast between the two systems became impossible to ignore. Reports from German units increasingly reflected a sense of inevitability. Pilots described skies filled with enemy aircraft beyond counting. Interception missions became defensive exercises rather than opportunities for control. Bombers were rarely stopped in full, and even successful engagements failed to alter the overall pattern. The Luftwaffe was fighting bravely, but it was fighting on terms it no longer controlled. This loss of control had strategic consequences far beyond the air war itself. Without air superiority, German ground forces became vulnerable to constant attack. Supply lines were exposed, troop movements were observed and targeted, and industrial centers suffered repeated damage. The air war had become the foundation upon which every other front depended, and that foundation was cracking. By the time Allied air superiority became undeniable, its effects were visible across every aspect of the German war effort. Cities once considered safe were now under constant threat. Factories were forced to disperse production, reducing efficiency and slowing output. Transportation networks struggled to function as rail yards, bridges, and fuel depots became regular targets. What had once been an air war between aircraft was now a sustained campaign against the foundations of the German state. For German commanders, the challenge was no longer how to defeat Allied air forces, but how to mitigate the damage they inflicted. Fighter units were concentrated around major industrial regions and population centers, leaving frontline troops increasingly exposed. Every defensive choice created a new vulnerability elsewhere. Protecting cities meant sacrificing battlefield support. Defending supply routes meant abandoning air cover over advancing or retreating armies. Allied tactics continued to evolve. Long-range fighter escorts eliminated the brief windows of opportunity German interceptors once relied upon. Bomber formations improved coordination, defensive firepower, and navigation accuracy. Losses still occurred, but they no longer altered the strategic balance. Each mission further exhausted German resources, while Allied strength remained largely intact. German pilots described a growing sense of futility. Interceptions often began with numerical disadvantage and ended with minimal effect. Even successful engagements failed to prevent bombers from reaching their targets. The psychological toll of constant combat under unfavorable conditions compounded the physical strain. Morale suffered as the reality set in that courage and skill alone could not change the outcome. On the ground, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Armored units struggled to maneuver during daylight. Supply convoys moved at night, risking delays and disorganization. Training facilities, once sheltered, were forced to relocate repeatedly, disrupting already weakened programs. The Luftwaffe's inability to secure the skies had transformed every movement into a calculated risk. Strategically, the loss of air control reshaped German decision-making. Large-scale offensives became increasingly difficult to plan and execute. Surprise was nearly impossible when enemy aircraft observed troop concentrations and logistical preparations. The initiative, once firmly in German hands, now belonged entirely to the Allies. By this stage of the war, the air conflict was no longer a contest Germany could influence meaningfully. The systems sustaining Allied operations were too large, too resilient, and too well protected to disrupt. Germany's air defenses, fragmented and overstretched, could only respond locally, never decisively. The air war had reached its final form. It was no longer about superiority, innovation, or tactical brilliance. It was about survival under relentless pressure. And for Germany, that pressure was no longer sustainable. As Allied air power tightened its grip over Europe, German attempts to regain control increasingly relied on short-term solutions that could not alter the larger trajectory of the war. Emergency measures replaced coherent strategy. Aircraft were scrambled with little warning. Missions were flown under unfavorable conditions, and losses mounted without corresponding gains. Each passing month reduced the Luftwaffe's capacity to respond effectively, even as the demands placed upon it continued to grow. One critical weakness became impossible to hide: the collapse of Germany's pilot training pipeline. Early in the war, German pilots accumulated extensive flight hours before entering combat. By this stage, that system had effectively broken down. Training units lacked fuel, aircraft, and experienced instructors. New pilots were rushed through abbreviated programs and sent directly to frontline units, where survival often depended on experience they did not possess. Attrition among these inexperienced crews accelerated the decline. Veteran pilots, once the backbone of the Luftwaffe, were gradually worn down. Continuous operations, limited rest, and diminishing chances of success eroded their effectiveness. Each loss represented not just an aircraft destroyed, but years of irreplaceable experience. Allied forces, by contrast, rotated crews, expanded training capacity, and maintained a steady influx of replacements. The imbalance widened relentlessly. Industrial limitations compounded the crisis. Germany's aircraft production struggled under bombing, resource shortages, and organizational inefficiencies. Complex designs required skilled labor and specialized components that were increasingly difficult to obtain. Delays became common, quality suffered, and operational readiness declined. Meanwhile, Allied factories produced aircraft at a pace that transformed losses into temporary inconveniences rather than strategic setbacks. Fuel scarcity remained a constant constraint. Even when aircraft were available, they often could not be flown. Training sorties were cancelled, combat patrols were shortened. Pilots entered engagements without sufficient preparation, further reducing effectiveness. The Air Force's theoretical strength bore little resemblance to its actual operational capability. German leadership continued to hope that selective success might stabilize the situation. Defensive victories were celebrated, isolated engagements emphasized, and technological breakthroughs anticipated. But none of these efforts addressed the underlying imbalance. The Luftwaffe could still inflict damage, but it could no longer shape the air war in any meaningful way. For Allied commanders, the situation was increasingly clear. Control of the skies enabled freedom of movement, protected supply lines, and allowed sustained pressure on Germany's industrial base. The air campaign was no longer preparatory, it was decisive. Every bombing mission, every escort operation, and every reconnaissance flight reinforced Allied dominance. On the German side, acknowledgement came gradually, often indirectly. Planning documents shifted tone, expectations were lowered, objectives were narrowed. The emphasis moved from winning the air war to enduring it. This shift was not announced publicly, but it was reflected in how resources were allocated and risks were managed. By the final stages of the conflict, the Luftwaffe existed primarily as a defensive force, reacting to Allied actions rather than initiating its own. The transformation was complete. What had once been a symbol of speed, innovation, and dominance had become a shield stretched too thin to provide real protection. The air war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany's loss of control above Europe had set the conditions for everything that followed. Ground operations, industrial output, and national morale were all shaped by a reality imposed from the sky. And once that reality took hold, there was no path back. As Allied dominance in the air became absolute, its influence reshaped not only military operations, but the psychological landscape of the war itself. German commanders increasingly planned under the assumption that the enemy would see everything. Concealment became difficult, deception unreliable, and movement hazardous. The air war had removed uncertainty from Allied planning while injecting it into every German decision. Daylight operations, once routine, turned into calculated risks. Armored formations delayed advances until weather or darkness offered limited protection. Supply convoys dispersed, slowed, and rerouted repeatedly, reducing efficiency and cohesion. The tempo of German operations suffered as the ability to act decisively diminished. Every delay compounded existing weaknesses. The Allied air campaign also eroded Germany's ability to recover from setbacks. Damage that might once have been repaired quickly now lingered. Bombed factories struggled to resume production. Rail networks remained disrupted. Fuel shortages deepened. The cumulative effect was not immediate collapse, but sustained degradation that left little margin for error. Within the Luftwaffe, leadership faced a dilemma with no solution. Concentrating forces offered temporary relief in selected areas, but left others exposed. Dispersing forces reduced losses locally, but ensured defeat everywhere. Neither approach altered the strategic imbalance. The enemy's capacity to absorb losses and continue operations remained untouched. Allied air superiority transformed the nature of resistance. German air defenses became fragmented, relying increasingly on ground-based systems to compensate for declining fighter presence. Anti-aircraft units expanded, but their effectiveness could not replace control of the skies. Bombers still reached their targets, fighters still escorted them. Reconnaissance still mapped German positions with precision. Reports from the period reflect a shift in tone that is difficult to ignore. Early optimism gave way to caution, then resignation. Expectations were adjusted downward. Success was redefined. The goal was no longer to deny the enemy access to German airspace, but to impose costs and delay the inevitable. This change did not occur overnight, but once it took hold, it shaped every subsequent decision. The contrast with Allied confidence was striking. Air power enabled coordination across vast distances. Operations were synchronized, supported, and reinforced from above. Ground forces advanced with knowledge that air cover would be present when needed. This assurance fundamentally altered how battles were fought and won. Germany's inability to contest this advantage had consequences far beyond the battlefield. Civilian morale suffered as cities endured repeated attacks. Industrial workers operated under constant threat. Resources diverted to emergency repairs and air defenses were unavailable elsewhere. The war effort became increasingly defensive, focused on preservation rather than progress. By this stage, the Luftwaffe's role had narrowed considerably. It could harass, disrupt, and occasionally surprise, but it could not dominate. The skies over Europe had become a permanent extension of Allied control. Every day that passed under this condition reinforced the same conclusion. The air war had been lost, not because of a single failure, but because the structure supporting German air power could no longer sustain prolonged conflict. This realization, once internalized, shaped the final phase of the war. Germany continued to fight, but it did so under constraints imposed from above. The loss of air control was not merely a tactical disadvantage, it was a strategic boundary that could not be crossed. And within that boundary, the outcome of the conflict was already determined. As the war entered its final phase, the consequences of losing the air war became irreversible for Germany. Allied control of the skies no longer needed to be proven through major engagements. It was enforced daily through constant presence. Bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft operated with increasing freedom, shaping the battlefield before ground forces ever made contact. The air war had ceased to be a separate front and had become the framework within which all other operations unfolded. German attempts to counter this reality relied heavily on improvisation. Emergency airfields were constructed and abandoned in rapid succession. Aircraft were dispersed to avoid destruction on the ground, reducing maintenance efficiency and complicating command and control. Communications suffered as infrastructure deteriorated under sustained attack. Each measure addressed an immediate threat but created new vulnerabilities elsewhere. The strain on personnel intensified. Ground crews worked under constant pressure, repairing aircraft that often returned damaged beyond practical recovery. Pilots faced missions with diminishing chances of success, aware that losses could not be replaced. The psychological toll of operating under constant Allied observation eroded confidence and initiative. Combat effectiveness declined not from lack of bravery, but from exhaustion and futility. Allied forces exploited this advantage methodically. Air reconnaissance identified troop movements, supply depots, and production sites with increasing accuracy. Targets were selected not only for immediate impact, but for cumulative effect. The objective was not dramatic destruction in a single strike, but sustained disruption that Germany could not recover from. Over time, this approach proved devastating. The imbalance in resources became stark. Allied aircraft losses, while significant, were absorbed without strategic consequence. Replacement crews arrived trained and prepared. New aircraft entered service continuously. German losses, by contrast, represented permanent reductions in capability. Each destroyed aircraft and crew narrowed an already shrinking margin. Technological developments, once seen as Germany's potential salvation, failed to change the outcome. Advanced aircraft demonstrated impressive performance in isolated encounters, but their numbers were insufficient, their reliability inconsistent, and their impact limited by fuel shortages and training deficiencies. Innovation alone could not compensate for systemic collapse. Strategically, German leadership recognized the limits imposed by air inferiority. Large-scale maneuver warfare became impractical. Defensive positions were strengthened not because they offered victory, but because they slowed defeat. The initiative belonged entirely to the Allies, who could choose when and where to apply pressure with minimal risk. The final months of the war confirmed what had become evident much earlier. Control of the air had allowed the Allies to dictate tempo, isolate forces, and dismantle Germany's capacity to resist. Ground victories followed patterns established from above. The air war had written the script long before the final battles were fought. In retrospect, the moment Germany realized the air war was lost was not marked by a single decision or announcement. It emerged through accumulated evidence, declining training standards, shrinking resources, and an enemy whose strength only increased with time. By the time this reality was fully acknowledged, it could no longer be changed. The loss of the air war sealed the fate of the German war effort. It removed flexibility, denied recovery, and imposed constant pressure that no tactical adjustment could relieve. What remained was endurance under conditions defined by the enemy until endurance itself was exhausted. In the aftermath of the war, military analysts from every major power studied what had happened in the skies over Europe. The conclusion was clear and remarkably consistent. Air superiority was not simply an advantage, it was a prerequisite for sustained modern warfare. The experience of Germany demonstrated that even a highly skilled and technologically advanced air force could not prevail without an industrial system capable of supporting prolonged conflict. The Luftwaffe's early victories had been real and formidable, its pilots were experienced, its aircraft innovative, and its tactics effective in short campaigns. But those strengths were structured around speed and surprise, not endurance. When the conflict evolved into a war of production, logistics, and replacement capacity, the structural weaknesses became impossible to conceal. Allied planners had approached the air war differently. Their strategy did not depend on a single breakthrough or decisive engagement. It relied on steady expansion, coordinated operations, and an industrial base prepared to sustain losses indefinitely. Over time, this approach transformed the air campaign from a series of battles into a system of pressure that Germany could not escape. The broader lesson extended beyond aircraft numbers or bombing tonnage. It was about integration. Air power enabled reconnaissance, protected supply lines, disrupted enemy production, and supported ground advances. Once Germany lost the ability to contest these functions effectively, every other aspect of its military effort was constrained. The air war shaped outcomes long before surrender documents were signed. Post-war military doctrine across the world reflected this understanding. Investment in pilot training, maintenance systems, and production scalability became central priorities. Air forces were no longer viewed as auxiliary arms, but as foundational elements of national defense. The experience of the Second World War redefined expectations about how wars would be fought in the modern era. For Germany, the realization that the air war was lost did not end the conflict immediately, but it defined the conditions under which the remainder of the war unfolded. Without control of the skies, recovery became impossible. Strategic flexibility vanished. Defensive efforts slowed defeat but could not reverse it. The story of Germany's loss in the air is therefore not simply a narrative of battles and aircraft. It is a case study in how structure, preparation, and endurance determine outcomes in prolonged conflict. Tactical brilliance may shape individual engagements, but sustained imbalance ultimately shapes history. By the time the war concluded, the transformation of air power was complete. The skies over Europe had demonstrated that control above the battlefield meant influence over everything below it. The moment Germany recognized that control was slipping away marked a turning point from which there was no return. The air war did not end with a single event, and it was not lost in a single day. It was lost through accumulation of losses, of shortages, of strategic miscalculations, and of an opponent whose capacity to endure exceeded Germany's own. In that accumulation lay the decisive shift that determined the fate of the conflict. One of the clearest indicators that Germany had lost the air war can be found not in dramatic battlefield events, but in internal production and loss reports from the later years of the conflict. By 1943 and 1944, the disparity between aircraft destroyed and aircraft replaced had become a structural problem rather than a temporary imbalance. German industry attempted to increase fighter output dramatically, and in certain months, production numbers appeared impressive on paper. However, these increases masked deeper weaknesses in pilot availability, fuel supply, and operational readiness. Aircraft without trained pilots were of limited value. Pilots without sufficient flight hours were vulnerable, and aircraft grounded due to fuel shortages might as well not have existed at all. While German factories worked under immense strain to assemble new fighters, Allied forces expanded not only production, but also the systems required to sustain combat operations. Replacement crews were trained continuously, maintenance systems were standardized, and supply chains were protected by overwhelming air cover. Statistical comparisons from the period reveal the magnitude of the imbalance. Allied aircraft output reached levels that dwarfed Germany's capacity even during its peak production months. More importantly, Allied losses were absorbed without long-term degradation of combat strength. German losses, by contrast, had cumulative effects. Each experienced pilot shot down represented a capability that could not be quickly restored. As bombing campaigns intensified, German production itself became increasingly vulnerable. Factories were dispersed into smaller facilities, moved underground, or relocated entirely. While these measures prevented total collapse, they reduced efficiency and slowed output. Transportation bottlenecks further complicated distribution of aircraft and spare parts. Even when new fighters were completed, delivering them to operational units became a logistical challenge. Meanwhile, Allied strategic bombing specifically targeted fuel infrastructure. Synthetic fuel plants, refineries, and transport hubs were systematically attacked. The effect was not immediate destruction of the Luftwaffe, but gradual paralysis. Training flights were reduced, operational missions were limited. Pilots faced combat with insufficient preparation. The shortage of aviation fuel became one of the most decisive constraints of the entire air war. German commanders were fully aware of these limitations. Reports circulated acknowledging the decline in readiness and the growing difficulty of sustaining air operations. Yet acknowledging a problem did not mean possessing the means to solve it. Industrial capacity, once surpassed, could not be expanded quickly enough under constant bombardment. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's situation was defined less by combat losses and more by systemic exhaustion. Aircraft numbers fluctuated, but the underlying infrastructure required to sustain air superiority had deteriorated beyond repair. The air war had evolved into a contest of systems, and Germany's system was failing under pressure it could no longer resist. While Germany struggled to sustain its air force under mounting pressure, the Allied system continued to expand with remarkable consistency. The difference was not merely one of numbers, but of structure and philosophy. The United States, in particular, had organized its war economy around scalability. Aircraft designs were standardized for mass production, components were interchangeable across models, and training pipelines were built with the expectation of heavy losses. The goal was not perfection in each unit, but resilience across the system. American aircraft factories operated with an industrial logic that Germany could not replicate under wartime constraints. Production lines were optimized for output. Supply chains were secured across continents, and raw materials flowed with minimal interruption. When losses occurred, they were anticipated and planned for. Replacement aircraft and crews were already in preparation long before they were needed. This approach transformed attrition from a liability into a manageable variable. The contrast in pilot training was equally significant. Allied training programs emphasized throughput while maintaining consistent standards. Large training facilities across the United States operated without fear of bombing, allowing pilots to accumulate hours in relative safety. By the time they entered combat, these crews were supported by experienced leadership, coordinated doctrine, and reliable logistical backing. Losses were tragic, but did not threaten the continuity of operations. German training systems, by comparison, were compressed and disrupted. Fuel scarcity limited flight hours. Bombing threatened infrastructure. Instructors were reassigned to combat units to fill gaps. The result was a cycle in which declining experience led to higher losses, which in turn required even faster training cycles. The system fed its own deterioration. Operational doctrine also diverged. Allied air strategy emphasized coordination between bomber groups, fighter escorts, reconnaissance units, and ground forces. Communication networks were reinforced and adapted continuously. Intelligence gathered from air reconnaissance directly informed battlefield decisions. The air war was integrated into a larger strategic framework that multiplied its impact. Germany, increasingly defensive, could not maintain this level of integration. Fighter units operated under pressure with limited flexibility. Coordination between air and ground forces suffered as communication systems were disrupted. Strategic initiative, once a hallmark of German operations, eroded steadily. The cumulative effect of these differences was decisive. Allied air power did not rely on singular technological breakthroughs or isolated victories. It relied on sustained systemic strength. Each month that passed widened the gap. Even when German aircraft achieved tactical successes, the strategic equation remained unchanged. By the final year of the war, the disparity was unmistakable. Allied aircraft roamed European skies in numbers that reflected not only industrial capacity, but organizational coherence. Germany's remaining air assets were increasingly reactive, constrained by shortages and limited by systemic collapse. The air war had become a demonstration of what happens when one side builds for endurance and the other for rapid victory. By the time Allied armies advanced deep into occupied Europe, the consequences of German air inferiority were fully visible on the ground. Movements that once relied on surprise and rapid coordination were now conducted under constant observation. Allied reconnaissance aircraft mapped defensive positions, identified supply depots, and tracked troop concentrations with increasing precision. What had once been concealed by speed and initiative was now exposed by aerial dominance. German armored formations, once the spearhead of rapid offensives, found themselves operating under severe constraint. Daylight maneuver risked immediate detection and attack from the air. Columns were forced to disperse, slowing movement and reducing cohesion. Supply convoys, already strained by fuel shortages, became vulnerable targets along roads and rail lines. The efficiency that had defined early campaigns gave way to caution and fragmentation. Allied fighter bombers played a critical role in this transformation. Operating with minimal resistance, they targeted vehicles, bridges, and transportation nodes. The destruction of key infrastructure isolated units and delayed reinforcements. Even when physical damage was limited, the psychological impact of constant aerial threat altered behavior. Commanders hesitated. Movements were postponed. Operational tempo declined. German defensive planning increasingly reflected this new reality. Positions were fortified not solely against ground assault, but against air attack. Camouflage, dispersal, and concealment became priorities. Yet these measures could not fully offset the advantage enjoyed by Allied air forces. The integration of air reconnaissance with artillery and armored units allowed Allied commanders to respond quickly to emerging threats. The inability to contest Allied air operations also undermined strategic mobility. Redeploying divisions across fronts became hazardous and slow. Concentrating forces for counteroffensives risked immediate detection and bombardment. Without secure skies, Germany's capacity to mount large-scale coordinated operations diminished sharply. As Allied forces approached German territory itself, the air campaign intensified rather than diminished. Bombing targeted remaining industrial centers and transportation hubs, ensuring that even as ground battles progressed, Germany's capacity to sustain resistance continued to shrink. The war's final phase unfolded within an environment shaped decisively by Allied control above. The cumulative impact of air superiority on ground operations confirms why the loss of the air war marked a point of no return. Once Germany could no longer defend its airspace effectively, every other front became more difficult to sustain. Tactical victories could delay defeat, but they could not reverse structural disadvantage. In the end, the realization that the air war was lost did not require a formal declaration. It was visible in restricted movement, disrupted logistics, and constrained strategy. It was visible in the shrinking reach of German forces and the expanding reach of their opponents. Above all, it was visible in the fact that the skies over Europe no longer belonged to those who had once dominated them. The loss of air superiority did not end the war immediately, but it determined the conditions under which it would conclude. When endurance and integration define modern conflict, control of the air becomes the decisive factor. Germany's experience in the Second World War remains a powerful example of how structural imbalance, sustained over time, shapes historical outcomes long before final battles are fought. Even after the strategic outcome of the air war had become irreversible, the question of when Germany truly understood that it had lost remains central to understanding the conflict. The recognition did not emerge from a single catastrophic defeat, nor from a public admission by high command. It emerged gradually, through patterns that could no longer be denied. Monthly loss reports revealed trends that optimism could not disguise. Replacement rates failed to match attrition. Training deficiencies became measurable rather than anecdotal. What had once been temporary setbacks solidified into permanent decline. By late 1943, and throughout 1944, internal German assessments increasingly acknowledged that the air situation was deteriorating beyond recovery. Efforts to concentrate fighter forces around key industrial regions reflected an implicit understanding that offensive air dominance was no longer possible. The strategic objective shifted from controlling the skies to limiting damage. Such a shift, though rarely described in explicit terms, represented an admission that the initiative had been permanently lost. The psychological dimension of this realization should not be underestimated. For years, the Luftwaffe had symbolized technological superiority and operational innovation. Its early campaigns had reinforced national confidence and military pride. Accepting that this symbol could no longer fulfill its intended role required confronting a deeper structural truth. The war had outgrown the system that Germany had built to fight it. Allied commanders, observing these developments, recognized the implications. Air superiority enabled sustained bombing campaigns, protected advancing ground forces, and disrupted German attempts at reorganization. The longer this condition persisted, the more it shaped the strategic environment. By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany itself, control of the skies was not contested in any meaningful way. The outcome of the air war had already framed the outcome of the broader conflict. From a historical perspective, the loss of the air war illustrates the decisive role of systemic endurance in modern warfare. Tactical excellence, advanced aircraft, and experienced pilots provided early advantages. Yet without scalable production, resilient logistics, and protected training infrastructure, those advantages could not be sustained. Germany's air force was formidable, but it was not built for prolonged industrial confrontation. The moment Germany realized the air war was lost, did not produce an immediate collapse. Instead, it imposed limits. It narrowed strategic options, reduced flexibility, and constrained recovery. From that point forward, every German decision operated within boundaries defined by Allied air power. The skies over Europe had become a constant reminder that control, once surrendered, could not be reclaimed. In the end, the air war's outcome was determined less by singular dramatic events and more by accumulated imbalance. Month after month, the disparity widened. Month after month, the ability to respond diminished. When the realization finally solidified within German leadership, it confirmed what the statistics had already shown. The contest for control above Europe had been decided long before the war itself reached its final chapter.